Hello and welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today we are talking to Thomas Jefferson as portrayed by Bill Barker, and we'll be speaking about his retreat house at Poplar Forest.
Oh, my. Well, I beg your pardon. Citizens, what a pleasure. I was just enjoying one of my pocket books. You can understand the reason why it would be known as such. It's a pocketbook, so very, very small that you are able to place it in your pockets, particularly when you travel over long distances, which I am often wont to do when I travel to my retreat house, Poplar Forest, a subject of your many questions today. You know, 1/3 of my library at Poplar Forest are composed of pocket books that I read along the journey. This particular edition is of John Bell's poets. John Bell's poets. He has quite a number, if you will, of his works, so published in Edinburgh, 1777. This one in particular on John Dryden, one of my favorite poets. But I beg your pardon, I belay our conversation that I look forward to in your company and welcome you once more to our Monticello. I'm happy to know that several have already put forth questions, and I look forward to further questions that you provide us. So as Miss Mel is with us once more, Mel Boyer, to provide the questions for me, I should not hesitate a moment but to receive the first one.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So many in your time are not acquainted with Poplar Forest. So where is it, and why did you refer to it as your retreat house?
Well, yes, here I am. Already the cat is out of the bag to talk about my retreat house. I try to keep it quiet. It is my retreat because I may retreat to it, to get away, literally, from the increasing numbers of curiosity seekers coming to visit here at our Monticello. More increasing year after year as we are approaching the 50th anniversary of the vote on our Declaration of American Independence. And yet before that, by 2 days, the 2nd of July, the 50th anniversary of the birth of our remarkable nation. So as it appears to become the wider known across the globe, so many are making their way to visit with me here at Monticello, and I've long needed a place where I can simply retreat, get away. In fact, I think in previous conversations, I discussed the necessity of a hermitage, a place for an individual simply to get away, where they are able alone, to be alone and read and write, but most importantly, a place where they may think. I've always sought that out, particularly as I traveled throughout the many kingdoms of Europe, and let alone here in our native land. So Poplar Forest has been my retreat. It is about 75 miles to the south, not so directly, maybe a little southwest here of Monticello. It is in Bedford County, and that 75 miles has never seen me any less than a good 3 days, either in the saddle or traveling in my phaeton, a gentleman's a carriage with 4 wheels, the 2 in front smaller than the 2 in back larger than, or as of 1814, the design of my Landau carriage, which is, you might refer to as a vis-a-vis, that you're able to sit opposite one and the other and look vis-a-vis, look to one and the other. So I travel with mostly members of my family in the Landau when I go to Poplar Forest. So that is the reason why I refer to it as my retreat. 75 miles south, near where Mr. Lynch conducts a ferry on the Upper James River. In fact, the vicinage is known more so now as the forest in Bedford County, somewhat south of Mr. Lynch's ferry.
So how did you then acquire Poplar Forest?
Through marriage. I acquired it as part of my wife's dowry. When Mrs. Jefferson and I were married, January 1772, well, then of course I would inherit as part of my wife's dowry much of the property of her first husband, Bathurst Skelton, let alone property that was provided for her from her father, John Wales. And so Poplar Forest, a good 4,000 acres and more, was provided as part of my wife's dowry in Bedford County directly from John Wales.
So can you tell us a little bit about your first visit there, or other early visits you might have had with your young family to Poplar Forest?
Oh, my, well, the first visit, of course, was all too soon after we were married. Actually, it was a little more than a year and a half after we were married, because in May of 1773, my father-in-law, Mr. John Wales, took ill suddenly and passed away. So I inherited, as part of my wife's dowry from him, quite an extensive acreage, about 11,000 acres in different parts of the West, and I discovered then a great deal of bad land. So I wanted to be able to ride out and inspect this inheritance to see what might become profitable to me and what I might have to let go of and try to sell. And so it was the following September of 1773 that I set out on a journey to inspect the lands known as Poplar Forest. Now, coincidentally, that 4,000 acres known as Poplar Forest included two creeks rolling through them, one known as Tomahawk Creek and the other as Judith Creek. Now, Judith Creek was named by my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, in honor of his sister, Aunt Judith. And you might wonder, well, what did my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, have to do with that particular vicinage? Well, my father surveyed much of what became Mr. John Wales' holdings. So when I went there first to Poplar Forest, I decided in that September of 1773, this indeed is going to prove one of the most lucrative of all of my holdings, all of my lands, because its soil was conducive to the cultivation of Orinoco tobacco, the finest tobacco, in my opinion, the sweet tasting tobacco, and particularly a hillside there facing south to where the original cabin stood up on a little raised hill that would be the most profitable for cultivating tobacco than even my lands here in Albemarle. So that is when I took my first journey there. And then, as you say, with my family, I will never forget, and we've had extensive reminiscences upon it, when the British nearly captured all of us here at our Monticello. That was Monday, June the 4th, 1781. And of course, with the warnings of the son of a good friend of mine, Jack Jewett the Younger, being the son, warning us that the dragoons set out by orders of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton were coming, making an advance to capture the governor of Virginia, which office I held at the time. They certainly would have incarcerated my family as well, I believe. So because Jack Jewett the Younger warned us, we were able to escape. And we escaped to Poplar Forest. Not before we spent about a week or so at Geddes Plantation, Geddes, the Hugh Rose Plantation in Amherst. And then from there, we went farther south and spent 1 month, the month of June, 1781, at Poplar Forest. I reflect back on it now as a month of absolute happiness, great serenity, there in the bosom of my family, and realized then what a sanctuary it was proving and might ever remain so, particularly after that month of June 1781. The immediate future brought such sorrow into my family, ultimately with the passing of my dear wife, as I said, from whom I inherited the property of Poplar Forest to begin with.
So after the death of your wife, you spent some time in France as our minister to France. Did that provide any further ideas for your use and improvement of dwellings and land at Poplar Forest?
Well, I may tell you that that I cannot think of anything else that would have provided me, may you say, a lessening of my great distress at the loss of Mrs. Jefferson than that opportunity to to see and engage the vaunted scene of Europe, that city of light, which I had the opportunity to therein to reside, commissioned our nation's minister plenipotentiary, representing our government at the court of King Louis XVI of France. 5 delightful years in La Belle, France, amongst the people whom I came to love so very much and have often considered my second home. Well, I want to digress. What influenced me there that helped me to further develop Poplar Forest, very simply, was my delight in the architecture that I discovered, not only in Paris, but throughout France. To be able to travel to the south of France and to see those morsels of architecture of the ancient world still left standing simply because they had received the approbation of the ages. To understand more distinctly, being able to see with the naked eye these buildings still standing, presenting them an idea of how the building was meant to sit in nature. You do not see that in a rendering within a book on architecture. In my opinion, you actually have to see the edifice as it is placed in nature to better understand that placement. And so you might say that the eventual design of the house, my retreat house at Poplar Forest, began during those years in France, to see how buildings were situate in nature. And the idea of the perfect proportion that a building could assume, providing both intimacy in its accommodation of living space within ennobling architecture. To become acquainted, if you will, of the octagon in its perfection, the dome in its perfection, the delicate delineations of a dome. You know, when I sailed to France the summer of 1784, there were no domes in North America, with the exception they were trying to build one on the State House in Annapolis. But there was no immediate prototype. There was nothing to judge how it might be built, and it was somewhat cumbersome, I cannot deny. So in France, being able to see the dome built on top of the Hotel de Salm, S-A-L-M, which of course was the prototype for the building of our Monticello and its dome, was allow me to recognize how an octagon can also play its importance in that sublime nobility that architecture may provide, which is simply to lift the soul to noble sentiments, particularly when you're sitting in the company of good friends and family and enjoying a repast. The Romans knew how to do it. Andre Palladio was able to effect it in the 16th century. And so therefore, to bring those principles forward into the modern world is what I sought to achieve, not only in the design of our Monticello, but also in what became my idea for the design of my retreat house, Poplar Forest.
So maybe we can turn a little bit to that designing. Dan had asked, when did you begin the design process for the house as it exists today?
When did I begin it? I would say it was the result, if you will, of the calling of my countrymen to stand for a second administration as Chief Magistrate of our nation. That is, that I should be asked to stand for 4 more years as our nation's president, commencing in 1804 with the presidential election of that year, and proving successful, far more successful than it had been 4 years previous in the election of 1800, and we need not get involved in that here on such a lovely day upon such an engaging conversation as architecture. But I will not deny, in 1804 I had lost, but I think 2 or 3 states. And it did not have to be settled by any electoral system in the final analysis. I also received the majority of the popular vote. So there I was. I beg your pardon, my countrymen, but there I was then, shackled to an office of administration for another 4 years. So it was at that time, realizing, if you will, a certain popularity I had achieved in the public eye, that the necessity of a retreat house was most important for me. So that is when, you might say, in 1805, after my inauguration, March the 4th, 1805, I began earnestly to design that retreat house as a perfect edifice in its intimacy, in its setting, in nature, and with the utility, if you will, of an octagon, and where that might be placed, occupied my ideas for the design of a retreat house. And so I began the construction of the retreat house at Poplar Forest in 1806, the year following.
Well, Dan also had a second part of his question, or two-parter. Were there any other habitations on the property when you first acquired it?
Yes, Dan, there was originally the cabin, and of course the enslaved cabins in and about the plantation. Those families, as you may know, I inherited from my father-in-law, Mr. Wales, and families who had also intermarried with families at our Monticello. Those families I inherited as well as part of my wife's dowry, who came to me to live here at El Monticello, from whence they had lived earlier at the forest, if you will, in Charles City County, where my late wife was born. So I can tell you that with the various outbuildings there, the kitchen, the outside kitchen to the cabin that originally stood on that height at Poplar Forest, and the enslaved cabins about the plantation, the mansion house would be quite the novelty, built at a short distance to the west of that original cabin, as it would be, of course, larger than that mere first cabin that was there, and it would take on the classical proportions of ancient architecture.
So you mentioned that there was an enslaved community living at Poplar Forest. It was a working plantation as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the enslaved people that lived there?
Well, yes, I can tell you that as we realized it was the finest of all of my holdings, that the soil was most conducive to the cultivation of the most refined tobacco that you could cultivate. That required, you might refer to it, a devoted and intensive labor. And I'm not going to deny the overseers there were rather hard, and I rather instructive as to how that might be best attended to and cultivated. I would say over the 53 years that I have been the owner of Poplar Forest, there have been upwards of about 93, 94 enslaved there upon those lands. Various families I mentioned earlier that were related even to families here at El Monticello. Amongst them, of course, were the Hubbards and the Hicks. There was the Cuff. In fact, of all of the names of the various families, a Cuff, I think, C-U-F-F, as we might spell it in our English language, was the most recognizable of the African surnames, of the African names that were applied to various families. We had, of course, Bedford John, as I have known him for years. We had Island Betty, who was there. We had Diana's, oh mercy, Lucy, Diana's Lucy. How can we forget little Lucy? And of course, as I'm referring to little Lucy, many of the laborers were young children that had to be attended to all manners, not only of the cultivation of tobacco, but of corn, of wheat that we eventually began to cultivate upon the plantation. Those enslaved families also cultivated their own vegetable gardens and sold much from their own vegetable gardens to the community, to residents who were residing in Lynchburg's ferry there. And yet I'm not going to deny for those 53 years, the labor was both intensive and though given Sundays and other days after harvest as a time for relaxation and leisure, it was a very hard life.
So how often throughout the year do you visit Poplar Forest, and how long do you stay?
I like to visit Poplar Forest several times a year. In fact, this time of year, this August, this year of 22, it is 22, is it not? 1822. I want to visit several times during the summer and stay for several weeks After you travel 3 days, you do not want to simply stay there for 3 days and then return. So it's never been less than a fortnight, sometimes for 2 months. And so I've tried to endeavor this as a retreat several times during the year and for several years now already. I think within the next year or so that I might consider the rheumatism bothering me more than it ever has, and of course not so adept at long journeys in the saddle or upon a carriage as I have been accustomed to persevere, that I might consider providing it as a legacy to my grandchildren, maybe Frank Epps, the most suitable. He's my grandson from my dearly loved daughter, Mariah Jefferson, who married her cousin, John Wales Epps, passed away here at Monticello when she was only 24. She had 3 children, but the only surviving was her son, Frank Epps. So I think most suitable, as Epps was the name of my wife's mother, my mother-in-law, that is her birth mother, that Frank might enjoy this inheritance. So I hope he is able to enjoy it as often as I have, several times a year, and to stay as long as he chooses there.
Well, piggybacking on that, Chester asks, which family members were invited to go with you when you went? Multiple times, or did you just travel alone?
Well, at times I did travel alone. Usually, Mr. Colbert, Burrow Colbert, would accompany me on occasion. John Hemmings, of course, who was most instrumental. John Hemmings was, well, I would pit anyone who has achieved great renown in joinery to compete with John Hemmings, and you will see Mr. Hemmings supersede him always. So at times John Hemmings would accompany me there and was most instrumental in the joinery of the woodwork within the house, the paneling and the kind, and of course my sequestered beds there that I have peculiarly designed. You'll not see anything like that. Alcove beds, you may refer to them. You see them in France, but you do not see any in France that I have designed specifically to stand in the middle of the room. So it's an entire wall, which in its essence is a bed, getting out both sides to adjoining rooms. So John Hemmings has certainly helped me in that. Now, as far as my grandchildren of my daughter, Mrs. Grandiff, Martha Jefferson Grandiff, I would say the 2 girls that attend more than any others, girls, mind you, are Cornelia and Virginia, who are wont to venture down with me to Poplar Forest. They both enjoy it very, very much. They have a bedchamber on the opposite side of the house from where my bedchamber is. Mine is on the west side of the house. Theirs is on the east, so they want to get the sun early enough in the morning time. And they're usually up early, though the sun's never caught me in bed. So they want to venture down there. And good friends, of course, the Reverend Clay, who has been a good friend of mine from Albemarle, has already taken up his seat in Bedford County. So he would join me on trips down there in the early years.
We've had a couple of questions come in about the designs of Poplar Forest and Monticello. Chester had a question about the Octagon and how that has played into it. And then tying into that, Marietta had a question about how did you actually come up with the designs for the homes?
Well, Chester, firstly, let me say that an octagon has always intrigued me. There may be some gentlemen who might understand better that it is of ancient design. It supersedes the design in nature of a sectagon, which of course is created from what mystery we do not know amongst bees. And you see in the bee houses, I have several bee houses here, how they are able in their own unique way to fashion these extraordinary sectagons. Well, think of an octagon. Think of the fact, if you will, that it took how long, our Creator, to create this universe? 7 days? Well, how do we not know? There may be another 8th that recognizes, well, let's just hope the great achievements of those who do our Creator's favor here during the short time we're on the globe. An honorarium, perhaps you might say. I should go no further with this, but think of an octagon in all of its proportions, still preserving an intimate space in its perfect proportions, one angle opposite the other. And then think further of the octagon when you have a window in each of those 8 sides. Well, then quite naturally, you're going to realize that there's no dark corner. No dark corner. And this I have achieved right here at Monticello in the dome room. And even those who want to come up and enjoy the dome room as I introduce it to them will notice that the side of the octagon built into the house could not possibly have a window, but it does have the design of a window, which is actually a mirror. So there the mirror is reflecting the light from the other 7 sides of that dome room. Now, take the same concept of an octagon and place it in nature, in its perfect setting. A building built as an octagon. Raise it from the ground like an elegant souffle in architecture, and place in each of the 8 sides a window. A framed window, which then is somewhat a frame in itself, opening out to a most sublime scene of nature in the distance. That was my intention, to perfect an octagon in nature in the design of Poplar Forest. And to think, if you will, when I originally designed how the house should be set in nature, I engaged Hugh Chisholm, a well-respected and accomplished mason, to set the foundation of the retreat house. I went back to the president's office, still there in my second administration, and corresponding with Mr. Chisholm, I realized, good Lord, it appears to me that from what he is informing me, that the foundation of the house is off several degrees. Well, that's several degrees too much, in my opinion. So I left the office, rode back to Poplar Forest, and discovered, yes, it was off several degrees, so that the windows placed in the 8 sides would not be revealing so sublime a scene of nature in the distance as it possibly could achieve. So, yes, I had Mr. Chisholm undo that foundation and turn it exactly as I desired it. And so, therefore, yes, I'm very pleased with the result of that and in the building of Poplar Forest. Now, you may wonder, well, I've mentioned the bed chambers. What about a dining chamber? Well, I've set the dining chamber in the very center of the house. The dining chamber is in the center. It has, if you will, elongated octagons along the 4 sides of this cubular room. And well, then you might wonder, as my bedchamber is on the west side in that elongated octagon, my visitors' bedchamber, my family bedchamber, whomever, is you're all welcome to come visit whenever you choose, is on the east side. I have a parlor, sitting room on the south side, and on the north side, it's the entrance hall with little reception rooms on each side. So you might say that elongated octagon on the north side is cut in 2 with that entrance hall leading you directly into the dining chamber. But then how could the dining chamber be lit? It's in the center of the building. And it's 20 by 20 by 20, a perfect cube, 20 feet by 20 feet by 20 feet. Some gentlemen here may better understand that as indicative of the design of the baths of Diocletian in ancient Rome. The dining chamber is lit by a skylight. I'm happy to say, as I've been informed, this year, 1822, it is the largest skylight in all of North America, 16 feet long and 2 feet wide. Now, I simply invite you to come to supper here or dinner in the middle of the day at Poplar Forest, and then think about what it might be like later in the evening when we can convene about the table, bring the carafe of wine, place it on the table in the center of the salle de manger, and simply by candlelight and moonlight on a moonlit evening to enjoy that sublime setting for discussions upon everything that we would care to enter into. So this is what I hope I have achieved. Now, here I've rambled off, and I cannot help but think Senator William McClay of Pennsylvania said most people think that Mr. Jefferson is rather reticent and retiring. He called me a sensationalist. He said, I've never known Jefferson to be silent a moment. He's always talking upon one subject to the other, and you cannot get a word in edgewise. So I beg pardon, there was a second part to the question here, and I've forgotten it entirely.
No, it's okay. It was fascinating. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We were just kind of going back to like the homes are unique, and like what did you think about when building them, or what are some of the differences between them?
You mean between Monticello,
And Poplar
Monticello,
Forest.
and Poplar Forest?
Yep.
Well, certainly the number of the rooms. I mean, Poplar Forest is much smaller. It's about a third the size, if you will, of our Monticello. I know Monticello is achieved now, and I doubt I'm really completed as yet, but upwards of about 11,000 square feet. 11,000 square feet at our Monticello, all told. And do you know that our Monticello is the same size as the late General Washington's Mount Vernon? Yes, and the same size, nearly 11,000 square feet, as our friend Mr. Madison's Montpelier. So Poplar Forest, I wish I could tell you exactly the square footage, but it's certainly about a third, and it's more confined, if you will. It's more of a perfection, if you will, of that octagonal design that you can achieve in a building. Monticello has continually been a work in progress. It has continually evolved through continued renovations. Monticello includes our very first Monticello, a much smaller house, only about 8 rooms, with a center section, 2 stories. And that is inside the further renovation of our Monticello. And the further renovation, as you know, is because of the design of the Hotel de Somme, that beautiful townhouse in Paris, which I watched being built while I was there, and which intrigued me to see 3 stories hidden behind a 1-story facade and then capped with a delicate dome. So I'm presuming then to recognize the difference between the two, that the one, Poplar Forest, being smaller and in my estimation more perfect in its design, both from the beginning to its completion, represents one of the finest dwelling houses in all of Virginia, in its intimacy, in its seclusion, in its setting, in nature there. Far more conducive to the private proclivities, that is, the proclivities of a private citizen, as a place where I may go to get away, where I may be comfortably in the company of my family, the company of my good friends, a place where I may read, a place where I may write, and most importantly, a place where I may simply think. Think. That's what a hermitage provides an individual. And imagine, I live in a 4-mile-an-hour world. I need a place where I can get away and think. So never forget that, as I think incumbent upon an individual to preserve that sanctity and that intimacy simply unto themselves.
So you alluded to this a little bit when you opened up, but Dan is asking if you traveled with a selection of your library when you traveled to Poplar Forest.
Oh, yes. Well, Dan, where did I put my little Bell's Poets? As I mentioned earlier, my little pocketbooks. I want to always accompany me, and literally in my pocket, a third of my library is relevant to the pocketbooks that I have there at Poplar Forest. Imagine, this is the 4th library that I've been able to create throughout my entire life. The first, of course, at Shadwell, where I was born and grew up, though that was my father's, which I inherited, though the majority were destroyed in a fire at Shadwell. That was back in February of 1770. The few books that I had up in my hermitage here, because that is what I referred to as what eventually became the honeymoon cottage on top of El Monticello. Those books from my father's library became the beginning, if you will, of my second library that accrued to, well, upwards of about 6,500, 600 books, which I eventually sold to our Congress in 1815. But I cannot live without books. You know that, Dan. I have a dog's appetite for books, a canine appetite for books. So I began acquiring further books, beginning a 4th library here at El Monticello, a 3rd library here at El Monticello. Now upwards, maybe about 2,000 books, 2,500, and then the 4th, now down at Poplar Forest. I would say in time it is upwards of about as many books then. Upwards of about 2,000 books, or maybe slightly less, and a third of it devoted to pocketbooks. And yes, I carry all authors with me. I've always believed the older I become, I'm an ancient Roman in many respects. I thoroughly enjoy still the ancient authors, Horace and Livy, Tacitus, even some of the Greeks, Thucydides and Euclid. And I still bring with me those gems of enlightenment of the modern authors, the works of Locke, Newton, and Bacon, which continue to open the mind, as I always try to maintain.
Circling back a little bit, we're all over the place today, Mr. Jefferson. Wanted to talk a little bit more about the enslaved carpenter John Hemmings. He was tasked at doing a lot of the building at Poplar Forest and also did some work here at Monticello. Can you tell us a little bit more about what he would have done?
Well, he did some of the molding at Poplar Forest, and all I have to suggest with that is be your own judge, visit. Now here I am further letting the cat out of the bag, but I think it is necessary. Even though it's my retreat house, no, I want to share this information. I want to share the achievements of such artisans as John Hemmings has achieved in his joinery, in his creation of the molding of the ceilings and the sideboards, of the doorways, the portals, and the like at Poplar Forest, and his instruction to others in that same art that they might carry it on. And this more than anything else, to allow them, I am hopeful, a free livelihood, to be able to have their own choice in their lives, which it appears I will never be able to allow them now. I mean, well, I'm not going to make excuses. But I welcome you to come visit yourself and see how remarkable this is. Many have already remarked that seeing Mr. Hemmings' work, they would rather allow it to remain in its natural woods, in the color of the woods that have been used. And yes, some of it is there for you to still see, but we're having it painted. We are going to have this all painted, a most lustrous, what you might refer to it as eggshell, and not a very blatant or bright white, but a comforting white. But still, nonetheless, you will be able to see Mr. John Hemmings' remarkable artistry. And again, I'm so happy that he is helping others to achieve such accomplishments in the art of joinery. Oh, and by the way, John Hemmings and I, when I may not be at Poplar Forest, or he may be here at Monticello, we correspond one with the other. So that is a great advantage to further enlightenment for others to understand how this has been done. And I hope these letters will continue through time so that the future will be able to read and understand this masterful art in joinery.
Well, we're reaching the end of our time today, so I wanted to give you one final question. What are your hopes for further improvements at Poplar Forest?
Reflecting back when we were talking about the influences that I was able to find inspirational during my 5 years in France, I cannot deny, let alone France, that I had the opportunity, particularly in the company of the Adams, John and Abigail Adams, to visit the Midlands of England and to visit many of the magnificent gardens of the manor houses there, Stowe and Chiswick, if you will, Blenheim in kind, and to see the work of magnificent landscape architects. Landscape, that's exactly how it is written, Landskip. You may refer to it as landscape if you choose, but no, the landscape has a particular, I think, intimacy to it. It is an art. It is an art that has been achieved by such renowned landscape designer as Capability Brown. His formal name is Lancelot Brown. He is called Capability Brown because he has shown the capability of embellishing the art of our Creator, the architect of our universe, who has provided the sublime terrain upon which we live. But here, Capability Brown, Thomas Whatley, Thomas Whatley, Batty Langley, others in that very same art have shown how we can help to embellish further the designs of our Creator, that we can give intake in nature. That is, very simply, where we think maybe a particular hill might be necessary in a vista, or a lake, a pond, or a stream might embellish further what we already have in nature. These aforementioned landscape architects allow us to achieve that. So I was able to see this as the Adams and I ventured through the Midlands of England, and to conceive the idea of an elegant carriageway that may be employed at my retreat house, Poplar Forest, that you all might have the opportunity to approach at a distance through the sublime vistas of nature, simply to enjoy nature, to enjoy the vistas, to enjoy crossing over streams without any worry of your carriage or your feet getting wet, to be able to see the creatures coming out of the woods there, perhaps a bear, or some of the hedgehogs that are there, the deer in abundance, and to make your way as you go along. I'm hopeful in designing 2 1/4 miles of such a carriageway to come out into vistas where there you'll see in the distance Poplar Forest. You'll see it, you'll be touched with it, but for a moment, let it simply tease you as to how you will approach it the farther on. And so that is what I hope to achieve. I hope to achieve a carriageway created, if you will, in its design, an imitation of many of the elegant carriageways upon which I traveled throughout the gardens of the Midlands of England. And I hope that it might lie as a ribbon there upon the delicacy of the terrain already provided. Secondly, the older I become, I am more devoted to the cultivation of roses. I think they are absolutely elegant flowers in nature. They have existed from time immemorial. And who can deny the representation of the red and the white rose in English history? I fancy the Rose of Alba. I fancy the Rose of Munda. And so therefore, I am hoping to cultivate more extensively a rose garden at Poplar Forest than I have been able thus far to achieve here at our Monticello. And all great varieties of roses, ancient roses, those who are the most vigorous throughout time in their plantings and last the longest. And some that you may rarely see. I've heard of one known as the Millbrook rose. It has its own special story to it, and I'm going to leave it unto you to discover the further and to find that in cultivation. Well, I move now to find that in cultivation, to pronounce boldly, at our Poplar Forest. Well, come visit. I've spoken extensively upon it. I can never cease to do so. It is my retreat house. Let it be yours as well as you come to visit us at our Monticello and travel on 75 miles. But 75 miles, I think you'll be able to make it in better time than I thus far have been able to achieve. So I thank you. I hope I have not neglected the curiosities of many of you. I feel I have, as usual, spoken overly long. But this does allow me the opportunity now to return to a further read of Mr. Dryden here in Bell's Poets. And if denied any further time before I set out, well, then I can simply either put my arms to the reins of my horse or sit back in my chariot and engage a further read upon the route to Poplar Forest. A good day to you all. I remain your humble and obedient servant, and I thank Miss Milboy for her attention to your questions here today. Godspeed.